Mr. Delgado, this court finds that you deprived individuals of their constitutional rights under color of law. You are hereby sentenced to 24 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release.
Yes, Your Honor.
Those 7 words would send Customs and Border Protection Officer Miguel Jr. to federal prison for 2 years. 7 words that meant a federal agent had used his badge as authority, his power to hurt people instead of protect them. September 26, 2024. El Paso, Texas. U.S. District Court. Miguel Jr., 41 years old, stood before Judge Kathleen Cardone as she handed down his sentence. 24 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Delgado had been a CBP officer, stationed at one of the busiest ports of entry in the United States. The Bridge of Americas connecting El Paso, Texas to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Thousands of people cross that bridge every day. Families, workers, travelers, people exercising their legal right to enter the United States. And Delgado was supposed to protect them. Instead, he assaulted them. 2 victims, 2 separate incidents. October 20th, 2019 and June 15th, 2020. 2 people who came to the Bridge of America's port of entry and encountered a federal agent who used excessive force against them, who hurt them, who violated their constitutional rights. Then Delgado did something even worse. He lied about it, falsified his incident reports, covered up his abuse of power with official documentation designed to make his victims look like the aggressors and himself look like the hero. But the truth came out. An investigation by the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General uncovered what really happened. In May 2024, a jury convicted Delgado on all counts. And in September 2024, he became one of the rare federal agents to actually go to prison for abusing his authority. This is the story of how justice, delayed but determined, finally caught up with a border agent who thought his badge made him untouchable. Before we dive deeper into this absolutely shocking story, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Your country, your state, wherever you are. And if you believe in holding authority figures accountable when they abuse their power, hit that subscribe button. October 20th, 2019. Bridge of America's port of entry, El Paso, Texas. The port is one of the busiest land crossings between the United States and Mexico, processing thousands of pedestrians and vehicles daily. A person identified in court documents only as Renner approached the port of entry that day. We don't know their full story. Their identity was protected throughout the legal proceedings. But we know what happened when they encountered CBP Officer Miguel Jr. According to federal prosecutors and court documents, Delgado used excessive force against Renner, causing bodily injury. The specific nature of the force used wasn't detailed in public court records, but it was serious enough to constitute a violation of Renner's constitutional rights. Under the Fourth Amendment, people have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. That includes being free from excessive force by government agents. Border Patrol officers have authority to inspect, question, and detain people at ports of entry, but they don't have the right to use force beyond what's reasonably necessary. Delgado crossed that line. He used force that wasn't justified, force that caused injury, force that violated Renner's rights. Then came the cover-up. What Delgado wrote in his incident report that day would become evidence of a second crime, one that would help send him to prison. After the incident with Renner, Delgado filed an official incident report. These reports are federal documents, sworn statements of what occurred during an officer's interaction with the public. They're supposed to be truthful, accurate account of events. Delgado's report was neither. According to federal prosecutors, Delgado falsified his incident report about the October 20th, 2019 encounter. He lied about what happened. He created a false narrative that justified his use of force and made Renner appear threatening or non-compliant, when that wasn't the truth. This wasn't a minor discrepancy or a difference of perspective. This was deliberate falsification of a federal document, a crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, which prohibits destroying, altering, or falsifying records with the intent to obstruct or influence an investigation. Delgado's lie was designed to cover up his excessive use of force, to protect himself from accountability, to ensure that his version of events, the false version, became the official record. For months, it worked. The falsified report sat in CBP files. Renner's complaint, if one was filed, went nowhere. Delgado faced no consequences. But then he did it again. And the second time would be his undoing. June 15, 2020, 8 months after the first incident. The same location, Bridge of America's port of entry. Another person, identified in court documents as Terry, encountered Officer Delgado. Once again, according to federal prosecutors and the jury that later convicted him, Delgado used excessive force. Once again, he caused bodily injury. Once again, he violated someone's constitutional rights. 2 incidents. 2 victims. 8 months apart. A pattern. Federal law enforcement agencies track complaints and use of force incidents. 2 excessive force incidents involving the same officer should trigger review, investigation, possibly discipline. But something prevented that from happening after the first incident. Likely Delgado's falsified report, which made it appear that his use of force was justified. So Delgado continued working, continued wearing his badge, continued having authority over people crossing the border, and when the opportunity arose, he abused that authority again. We don't know the specific details of what happened to Terry. Court records don't reveal the nature of the force used or the injury sustained. But we know it was serious enough to violate federal civil rights statutes. And we know that this time, the truth wouldn't stay buried. An investigation was beginning, and Delgado had no idea his career and freedom were about to end. Sometime after the June 2020 incident, someone started asking questions. Maybe Terry filed a complaint. Maybe witnesses came forward. Maybe patterns in Delgado's reports raised red flags during an internal audit. However it started, the FBI got involved. So did the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, the watchdog agency that investigates misconduct within DHS, which includes CBP. Federal investigators began looking into Officer Miguel Jr.'s conduct. They reviewed his incident reports. They interviewed witnesses. They gathered evidence about what really happened on October 20th, 2019 and June 15th, 2020. And they discovered the discrepancies, the lies, the excessive force, the pattern of abuse. This wasn't a simple internal affairs matter anymore. This was a federal criminal investigation. Under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, it's a federal crime for anyone acting under color of law, including Border Patrol agents, to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights. When that deprivation involves bodily injury, the crime carries up to 10 years in prison. Delgado was facing serious charges. Federal charges, potential prison time. In 2023, the investigation concluded, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas made a decision that would change Delgado's life forever. The federal grand jury in El Paso heard the evidence against Miguel Jr. They reviewed documents, heard witness testimony, examined the case built by FBI and OIG investigators. Then they voted to indict. The indictment charged Delgado with 3 federal crimes. Count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law, October 20th, 2019 incident with Renner. Count 2, deprivation of rights under color of law, June 15th, 2020 incident with Terry. Count 3, falsification of records in a federal investigation, the false incident report about Renner. Each count carried serious penalties. The deprivation of rights charges, involving bodily injury, carried up to 10 years in prison each. The falsification charge carried up to 20 years. Delgado faced a maximum of 40 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. The indictment was unsealed. News outlets in El Paso reported the charges. A CBP officer, trusted with authority at one of America's busiest ports of entry, accused of assaulting 2 people and lying about it. Delgado pleaded not guilty. His attorney argued that whatever force he used was justified, that he was just doing his job, that this was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The case was headed to trial, and a jury would decide whether a federal agent was a criminal. May 2024. Federal courthouse in El Paso, Texas. The trial of United States versus Miguel Jr. began. Federal prosecutors presented their case. They called witnesses who'd seen what happened. They presented medical evidence of the injuries Renner and Terry had sustained. They showed the jury Delgado's falsified incident report and explained how it didn't match the actual events. The victims testified. Renner and Terry, their identities still protected, told the jury what Delgado had done to them, how he'd used force that wasn't necessary, how he'd hurt them, how they'd been violated by someone who was supposed to be protecting the border, not abusing people trying to cross it legally. Expert witnesses testified about use of force standards, about what's reasonable and what's excessive, about the Fourth Amendment and constitutional protections against government abuse. The defense argued that Delgado had acted appropriately, that border agents faced difficult situations, that whatever force he used was in response to resistance or threat, that he was being scapegoated for doing a tough job. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through the lies. They heard the victims. They saw the pattern. They understood that Delgado had abused his power not once but twice, then tried to cover it up after deliberating. The jury returned their verdict, and it would send shockwaves through CBP. The jury foreman stood and read the verdicts. Count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. Count 2, deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. Count 3, falsification of records, guilty. Miguel Jr., federal agent, convicted felon. The courtroom reaction wasn't recorded, but we can imagine the weight of that moment. The victims, finally vindicated. The prosecutors, their case proven. And Delgado, facing the reality that his career was over and prison was coming. Guilty verdicts in federal cases involving law enforcement are relatively rare. Most cases never make it to trial. They're dismissed, charges are dropped, or officers are allowed to resign quietly. When cases do go to trial, juries often give officers the benefit of the doubt. But not this time. The evidence was too clear, the abuse too obvious, the lies too blatant. The jury had spoken. Miguel Jr. was a criminal who'd used his badge to hurt people. After the verdict, Delgado was released on bond pending sentencing. He was ordered to surrender his passport, stay in the Western District of Texas, and comply with pretrial supervision conditions. The conviction was a victory for justice. But the real question remained, what punishment would Delgado face? September 26, 2024. 4 months after the conviction, Miguel Jr. returned to Judge Kathleen Cardone's courtroom for sentencing. Federal sentencing is complex, guided by sentencing guidelines that consider the nature of the crime, the defendant's criminal history, aggravating and mitigating factors. For Delgado's crimes, the guidelines likely recommended a significant prison sentence. The prosecution argued for a substantial sentence. They emphasized the seriousness of Delgado's crimes, not just the use of excessive force, but the betrayal of public trust. Delgado had been given a badge, a gun, authority over people's lives. He'd sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, and he'd violated that oath by assaulting 2 people and lying about it. They argued that a strong sentence was necessary to punish Delgado for his crimes, deter other federal agents from similar misconduct, show victims of government abuse that the system can deliver justice, restore some measure of public trust in law enforcement. The defense argued for leniency. They presented Delgado's background, his years of service, character witnesses who said he was a good person who made mistakes. They asked the judge to consider a lighter sentence, possibly probation or home confinement instead of prison. Judge Cardone listened to both sides. Then she announced her decision. The sentence she imposed would send a clear message about accountability for federal agents who abuse their power. The defendant is sentenced to 24 months imprisonment on each count, to run concurrently, followed by 3 years of supervised release. 24 months. 2 years in federal prison. It wasn't the maximum. Delgado could have received up to 40 years. But it wasn't a slap on the wrist either. 2 years in federal prison, where he'd be surrounded by people whose lives have been destroyed by the criminal justice system he'd represented. Judge Cardone also ordered Delgado to pay restitution to his victims, though the amount wasn't publicly disclosed. The sentence meant Delgado would serve real time. Federal prisoners must serve at least 85% of their sentence. There's no parole in the federal system. Delgado would spend approximately 20 months behind bars. After his release, he'd face 3 years of supervised release, essentially federal probation. Any violation could send him back to prison. His career with CBP was over. Federal conviction meant permanent termination. He'd never work in law enforcement again. His pension was likely forfeited. One pattern of abuse, one cover-up, one federal investigation, one trial, one conviction. And Miguel Jr.'s life was permanently changed. But this case is about more than one corrupt agent. It's about a system that rarely holds federal agents accountable. And what happens when it finally does? Miguel Jr.'s conviction and imprisonment is unusual. Federal agents, particularly Border Patrol and IC agents, rarely face criminal prosecution for excessive force or civil rights violations. Consider the statistics. Between 2010 and 2020, there were over 1,200 complaints of excessive force against CBP agents. Of those complaints, fewer than 20 resulted in criminal charges. Even fewer resulted in convictions. Almost none resulted in prison time. Why? Several factors. Qualified immunity. Federal agents are often protected by qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that shields government officials from civil lawsuits unless they violate clearly established rights. Institutional protection. Federal agencies often close ranks around accused agents, fighting investigations and defending officers even when evidence suggests wrongdoing. Prosecutorial reluctance. U.S. attorneys must work closely with federal agents on other cases, creating potential conflict of interest when prosecuting those same agents. High burden of proof. Federal civil rights prosecutions require proving the agent acted willfully to violate rights, a difficult standard to meet. Delgado's case overcame all these obstacles. The evidence was clear. The victims were credible. The investigators were thorough. The prosecutors were committed. The jury was convinced. And the result was a rare example of federal accountability. But would it change anything? The United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas issued a statement after Delgado's sentencing. This prosecution and sentence demonstrate that no one is above the law. Federal agents who abuse their authority and violate the constitutional rights of others will be held accountable. Strong words, but do they reflect reality? Delgado's case shows that accountability is possible, that federal agents can be investigated, prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned for abusing their power, that victims of government abuse can see justice. But Delgado's case is also exceptional. It took 2 separate incidents, credible victims willing to testify, a thorough federal investigation, prosecutors willing to bring charges, and a jury willing to convict. Most cases don't have all those elements. For every Miguel Jr. who goes to prison, how many other federal agents commit similar abuses and face no consequences? The families of Renner and Terry received some measure of justice. Their abuser was convicted and imprisoned, but that justice came years after the abuse. October 2019 to September 2024, nearly 5 years. And for all the other victims of excessive force by federal agents, those whose cases didn't result in charges, whose complaints were dismissed, whose abusers were protected by the system, Delgado's conviction is both a victory and a reminder how rarely justice comes. Miguel Jr. is currently serving his 24-month sentence in a federal prison facility. When he's released, he'll be a convicted felon, barred from law enforcement, living under supervised release for 3 years. His victims carry the trauma of what he did to them, but they also carry the knowledge that he was held accountable, that the system, for once, worked. This case proves that federal agents can be prosecuted for abusing their power. It proves that badges don't grant immunity from consequences. It proves that justice, though difficult and rare, is possible. The question is, will Delgado's conviction inspire more accountability? Or will it remain an exception in a system that too often protects the powerful and ignores the abused? Only time will tell. But for Renner and Terry, for everyone who's ever been victimized by a federal agent who thought their badge made them untouchable, Miguel Jr.'s imprisonment stands as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, justice wins. This story is based on publicly available court records and Department of Justice press releases about United States versus Miguel Jr. due to privacy protections and sealed court documents. Specific details about the victims and the exact nature of the excessive force are not publicly available and therefore not included in this account.